Chapter 2, Finding a Job. It took many hours to travel from Madison to Chicago in 1886. The long train trip gave Frank a chance to think about the fine buildings he would see. Chicago's architects were taking the lead in developing new architectural ideas. The world's tallest office building, designed for the Home Insurance Company by Chicago architect William LeBaron Jenney, was finished in 1885. He wanted to learn more about Jenney and his fellow architects, William Holabird and Louis Henri Sullivan, who had created a special style of architecture for Chicago. Frank admired these men because they were experimenting with steel skeleton construction that gave the buildings extra strength and made it possible to build them higher than any other buildings in the world. Because Jenney, Holabird, and Sullivan wanted their buildings to show the steel skeleton construction, they made the outsides of their buildings the same shape as the steel skeleton inside. Large windows filled the outside walls, and there were few decorations. The Chicago architects felt the height and simplicity of a building was its beauty. These buildings were the first skyscrapers in the new style of American architecture. Nicknamed the Chicago School, excited Frank. He dreamed of working for one of those great men, and he dreamed of wearing fashionable clothes and seeing everything the city had to offer. Frank was disappointed when he arrived in Chicago. The city of his dreams was a mess of muddy, unpaved, dimly lighted streets. These streets were filled with strange-looking people speaking languages he couldn't understand. To his country eyes, everything he saw was unfamiliar to him, and it was ugly, dirty, and depressing. He wished he were back home. However, he did not sit around feeling sorry for himself. He had come to Chicago to learn about architecture, and he meant to do exactly that. Since there were still a few hours left before bedtime, he set out to see the city sights. First, he spent $1 at the ballet at the Chicago Opera House. Then he rode a cable car around the city. Finally, he treated himself to a good meal. After paying one night's stay at the hotel, he was left with $3 in his pocket. Frank had been in Chicago only a few hours, and more than half of his money was already gone. He was worried, but did not lose confidence in himself. He made a plan. The next morning, he would buy a bunch of bananas and save money by eating only bananas until he found a job. Chicago was growing from a town into a city when it was almost completely destroyed by a gigantic fire in 1871. Because Chicago was the best port on the Great Lakes, the center for new railroads, the city rebuilt quickly. There were plenty of opportunities to make money in Chicago, and many people became very wealthy. These people needed factories, offices, and homes, and they kept every architecture office busy. There was no better place or time for being an energetic young man who dreamed of being an architect looking for a job. However, finding a job takes time, and Frank was short on time because he was short of money. Finding a job was a discouraging task. Frank was turned down by every architecture office he visited. Sometimes he asked to come back in a few weeks. That was encouraging, but Frank could not wait that long. He had already grown tired of eating bananas. Finally, he tried the office of architect J.L. Silsby. He had put off applying there because he knew Silsby was designing the new All Souls Church, where his uncle, Jenkin Lloyd Jones, was the minister. Frank was in a dilemma. He desperately needed a job, and telling Silsby he was the nephew of an important client would help him get one, but he didn't want to get the job because he was related to the minister. In the end, Frank never said a word about his uncle to Silsby, and Silsby never guessed who he was. Silsby was impressed with Frank's courage and self-confidence and hired him on his own merit. Frank had a job, but he still had money trouble. It would be 1 week before he was paid, and the money in his pocket would not last long. Chapter 3, Learning to be an Architect. National Farmers Bank, Owatonna, Minnesota, Louis H. Sullivan, architect. Cecil Corwin, another young man who worked in Silsby's office, noticed that Frank looked worried. Cecil guessed he was hungry and treated him to a simple meal of corned beef hash at a nearby restaurant. From that day on, whenever Frank was really hungry, nothing satisfied him more than corned beef hash. Frank and Cecil shared an interest in music, books, and architecture. They enjoyed working together and spent their free time walking the streets of Chicago, studying what Frank called an outdoor school of architecture. They especially admired the buildings designed by Louis H. Sullivan, which were simple shapes with large main entrances framed by gigantic stone archways. Around the archways and at the top of each building was a band of sculptured decoration. The decorations reminded Frank of the plants and flowers he loved from the farm in Wisconsin. Frank admired Silsby, but he was soon discouraged by the quality of work he was doing. He complained to Cecil, "We are just making pretty pictures to show Silsby's clients. The buildings he constructs never look like the pictures." Cecil replied, "Frank, architects have to be practical. They need to keep making money, so they build what clients ask them to." "That's not honest, Cecil." Frank was remembering an old Welsh motto his uncles taught him, "Truth against the world." "Cecil," he said, "each man must do the best he knows how to do, and not just what he is told to do." Each man must do the best he knows how to do, and not just what he is told to do. That's very interesting. When Frank heard that Louis H. Sullivan's office was advertising for a new draftsman, he wanted the job. Sullivan, he thought, was an honest architect. He applied for the job, refusing to speak to anyone but Sullivan himself. Sullivan, who never took time to talk to young draftsmen, finally came out to look at the drawings Frank had traced at Silsby's office. Sullivan was not happy with their work, but he liked the enthusiastic young man and gave him 1 week to prepare new drawings. After working late into the night for several days, Frank showed Sullivan the new drawings. He was hired. Frank started work in Sullivan's office with one definite idea about architecture. He thought a new country needed a new style of architecture. Most of the buildings that surrounded him were copies of buildings that had been built in Europe hundreds of years ago. He admired Louis H. Sullivan because, more than any other architect, Sullivan was creating a new American architecture. Frank worked hard in the office all day and then stayed after work to share ideas with Sullivan. Often they talked about William Morris, an Englishman who encouraged artists and architects to work with their hands. Morris believed the shapes found in nature would lead to new, honest style of architecture. Sullivan explained his organic whole architecture, where the parts of buildings fit together in harmony the same way music notes work together in beautiful songs. Within a short time, Frank was calling Sullivan his Liebermeister, which means beloved teacher in German. Soon, Sullivan moved into a special office right next to his own, and they worked together on Chicago's new auditorium theater and on a building for the 1893's World Fair held in Chicago. When Sullivan's clients asked for house designs, the jobs were turned over to Frank. One evening, Frank and Cecil went to a costume party. Frank, who loved dressing up in costumes, was a French army officer carrying a sword and a fancy shirt, tight pants, and high boots. Imagining himself to be very handsome, he dashed across the room, greeted some friends. On the way, he knocked over a tall, beautiful young girl with red hair. Frank introduced himself as he picked her up. The girl, Catherine Tobin, was amused with him, and the two soon became close friends. When they were asked permission to marry, both families refused. However, Frank and Catherine were determined, and they finally went out. Many people at the wedding cried. They cried because they were happy for the young couple, but they also thought they were too young for the responsibilities of marriage. Frank was 21 and Catherine was 18. Chapter 4, A Home. Here's a flower planter of the Frank Lloyd Wright home and studio. Frank was happy to accept the responsibilities of his new life. He had a loving wife and a good job. His mother and sisters lived nearby, and Louis H. Sullivan had advanced him enough money to build a house on some land he owned in Chicago suburb named Oak Park. There were a few houses standing on Forest Avenue, but most of the land surrounding the building was beautiful open prairie. Frank had designed traditional houses for Sullivan's clients. Now, he had his first chance to design a new kind of house. He looked thoughtfully at the fashionable Victorian-style houses. He saw they were big, ugly, overly decorated boxes. It seemed the recipe for decorating the outside of these gingerbread houses called for as many different ingredients as possible. It was not uncommon to find brick, stone, plaster, wood siding, decorative ironwork, fancy shingles, and colored glass used on the outside of a single house. These materials mixed together on the surface of the house to create an elaborate porches, towers, turrets, gables, verandas, balconies, and chimneys. The big, overdressed box houses stuck out like sore thumbs on a beautiful prairie. Frank wanted his house to remind him of the shapes and colors of nature that he loved on the farm in Wisconsin. He could make this happen if he used building materials that blended together with organic harmony, and the same organic harmony he saw in the landscape, where the shapes and colors are part of nature's endless, incredible patterns. On the left is a picture of a Victorian house. He also wanted it to blend into the long, endless look of the Illinois prairie. At Silsby's office, he had worked on houses designed in the shingle style that were harmonious with the nature's colors and shapes. Frank made the outside shape of the shingle-styled house simple, like the geometric shapes in the Freudenthal blocks. He chose building materials that worked together in harmony, like melodies in the music he loved. He covered the roof and walls with cedar shingles in their natural brown color. He used long brown bricks at the bottom in order to blend the house with the earth. He placed windows across the front and a band that reminded him of the long look of the prairie. Frank's organic approach to his house did not end on the outside. He thought the inside of the gingerbread houses were as cluttered as the outside. The small box-like rooms were stuffed with furniture, flashy knickknacks, and every imaginable kind of decoration. Frank wanted his entire house to be harmonious. Both inside and outside would remind him of the open spaces on the prairie and the beautiful shapes and colors he loved on the farm. He would join his house together in perfect harmony like a musical composition. At first, the house was small, just 6 rooms, but Frank made it look bigger. He used wide openings between rooms, and in places he took the walls completely away. He joined the tops of the windows and doors with a continuous band of wood that flowed from one room to another. He designed the furniture with simple lines and joined the furniture with the house. Above is a highly decorated Victorian-style vase. Below is a simple vase with more harmonious in nature. Okay. I just got puked on. Do we even have a... Eli? Ooh, look at these. Above, Frank Lloyd Wright, home and studio. This is Oak Park, Illinois. On the left, see that? And then the right page is Inglenook with open spaces in the wall above the seat. He built bookshelves, cabinets, tables, benches, and window seats into the house. Walls and ceilings were painted in the soft gold and greens he found in nature. The house was decorated with wildflowers, leaves, and other objects of simple, natural beauty. Frank thought his fireplace should provide a warm gathering place for his family. It was to be the heart of his house, and just as a human heart is located in the center of the chest and keeps the body alive, he located the fireplace in the center of his home to allow warm air to flow through to other parts of the house. His family and friends enjoyed the warmth of the fire when they gathered in the Inglenook, a small private place to sit next to the fireplace. As an inspiration to his family, Frank carved one of his favorite family mottos, "Truth is life," over the mantle. Under this model was another reminded, "Good friend, around these hearthstones speak no evil words of any creature." Frank and Catherine were happy in their harmonious, organic home. They were often joined by their mothers, Catherine's father, grandmothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and cousins. In a short time, children of their own were born. The first 3 were named Lloyd, John, and Catherine. Since the parents were not much older than the children, it often seemed to the neighbors that the house was filled with all children and no parents. People who visited Frank and Catherine's house talked about it because it was unusual. People were afraid of things that seemed strange because they were new and different and did not like the house. But those with open minds were drawn to it. Some of them visited Frank at home and asked him for house designs. He did the work without telling Sullivan. Eventually, Sullivan found out and was angry. Frank, he said, you must work only for me. Frank wanted to work on his own project in his free time, and he stood his ground. After working for his Liebermeister for 5 years, Frank left and opened his own office. Although he would miss working with Louis H. Sullivan, it was time for him to leave. Frank had one worry. Would clients continue to bring him work now that he was on his own? Chapter 5. A Studio. Here's the Wright family. See them? And this is the Winslow house in River Forest, Illinois. Full of dreams, Frank moved into an office space with Cecil Corwin in downtown Chicago. They hoped for big projects like the ones they had worked on with Silsby and Sullivan, but the big projects did not come. Instead, a businessman named William Winslow had a small project. Winslow thought of himself as an amateur architect and could have designed his own house, but he thought Frank would do a better job. Now that he had his first client, Frank felt he was on his way to success. The outside window of the Winslow house attracted attention. Tile on the sides of the house and strong horizontal bands of brick emphasized the lines of the prairie. Perhaps the most amazing feature of the house was the roof that appeared to float over the house. Frank built a drafting room in his original house, but his family kept filling up his workspace. He solved the problem by building it. Oh my goodness. Ugh, huge puke. Okay. You okay? Ugh. Alright, well, we'll continue this later. Wipe it off. Okay. Let's see. Frank built a drafting room in his original house, but his family kept filling up his workspace. He solved the problem by building a new studio next to the house in 1898. This way, he could have a private workspace close to his family. The office had an octagonal 8-sided library and drafting room with a balcony that had balance between the floors and ceilings with a clever system of chains and weights engineered by Frank. A willow tree stood between the house and the new studio. Frank could not bear to cut the beautiful tree down, so he left it in place and built a passageway around it. Many neighbors on Forest Avenue talked about the unusual house with the tree growing up through the roof. Wow. It's very clever. And there's Frank Lloyd Wright right there. Left, Catherine Wright and children. Right, a dining room and playroom grill. In the meantime, the house grew in wonderful ways to make room for the 3 new children, David, Francis, and Robert Llewellyn. The children needed bedrooms, so Frank cut his old upstairs drafting room in half to make a girl's bedroom and a boy's bedroom. To make the small rooms feel bigger, Frank left a big open space at the top of the wall separating them. The open space allowed light and air to travel freely from one room to another. The children were delighted with their new bedrooms, for soon they would discover that pillows, toys, and secret messages could also travel very easily over the wall with no top. Around the table in the dining room were chairs with very high backs. When the children sat on the chairs in the backs, they seemed to reach right past their heads to the ceiling. They felt like Alice in Wonderland in a small private room within a big room. When guests came for dinner, the children giggled upstairs. They wondered how long it would take for guests to guess the secret of the dining room's lighting. They imagined the surprised looks on the faces when they noticed the shadows of the tree branches on the dining room table. It was a wooden grill and paper that covered an empty space in the ceiling where light bulbs were hidden. When the lights were turned on, the grill appeared to be flooded with sunlight. Before dinner, the children helped Frank put freshly cut tree branches above the paper. Catherine Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright's wife. Their children, top row, left to right, David Samuel Wright, Catherine Lloyd Wright, John Lloyd Wright, Robert Llewellyn Wright, Francis Lloyd Wright, and Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. And then this, ooh, that's the children's playroom. It's beautiful. For the children, the most wonderful new addition was found at the top of the house. A stairway and a dark hall and a very low ceiling led to a mysterious doorway. When they opened the curtains, they found themselves in a gigantic, sunny playroom. The ceilings high above them had another decorative wooden grill. The balcony was their tree house. They could sit on the window seats and imagine they were looking down at the world from their own fairy tale castle. The playroom was the center of the family life, where the children played with their toys. Foible blocks, marbles, dolls, metal soldiers, stuffed toys, and tiddlywinks. Frank played with his toys too. He was known to have filled his room with dozens of colored helium balloons and arranged them in patterns on the ceiling. Catherine taught kindergarten classes to her first 3 children and neighborhood children in the playroom. On some evenings, the family orchestra practiced there. Lloyd played the cello, John played the violin, Catherine sang, David played the flute, Francis played the piano, and baby Llewellyn played the mandolin. Okay. You okay? Frank wanted a grand piano in the playroom. He did not want to take up the children's play space with big instruments, so he thought of an unusual solution to the problem. He cut a piano-sized hole in the wall. The piano was moved into place. The keyboard was on the playroom side of the wall, and the rest of the piano hung out over the stairway on the other side of the wall. During the weeks before Christmas, Catherine and Frank's sister, Maganelle, baked cookies. On Christmas Eve, the children hung their stockings on the fireplace. In the morning, their playroom was transformed into a fairyland. A huge tree decorated with ornaments, tinsel, and real candles stood in the center of the room. The stockings were stuffed with oranges, nuts, candy, spiced cakes, cookies in shapes of little men, and surprises wrapped in funny packages. Some presents, like doll carriages and bicycles, were left unwrapped under the tree, but the best presents were in their big boxes, wrapped in fancy paper and tied with ribbons. The children would struggle to unwrap the boxes and find smaller boxes wrapped inside. Frank watched with delight as they unwrapped box after box, finding box after box inside. Finally, inside the smallest box was a tiny china doll or a funny mechanical animal. When Easter arrived, the family gathered budding tree branches and other signs of spring and carried them up into the playroom. Catherine Maganelle and the little girls purchased silk flowers and ribbons to decorate the straw hats. Everyone in the family had a new Easter outfit to wear at the services at Uncle Jake's All Souls Church. After Catherine and the grandmother cooked a special feast, the children played games and hunted for colored eggs, baskets full of fuzzy chicks and candy. Easter was a wonderful holiday. It reminded Frank of the Sunday family festivals he loved in the farm in Wisconsin. Frank spent Saturdays at auctions looking at antiques. When he bought a treasure home, he would spend hours rearranging the furniture. Can we finish this chapter and then stop? To suit the new addition. Sometimes Catherine wished all the furniture in his house was either built in or nailed down, so Frank would stop moving it around. Frank was well liked by his Oak Park neighbors, and he was well known in other parts of Chicago too. He wore dashing clothes and found endless ways to knot handsome neckties. He had a wonderful laugh and a talent for turning tears into laughter. People said the party began when Frank arrived and ended when he left. Whenever he had the opportunity, Frank spoke to groups of people interested in the organic architecture. The publicity helped to make him a very popular architect. Soon, he received a tempting offer. This is the entrance to Frank Lloyd Wright's studio. Okay, we're done for now. We'll read the rest later, okay? You want to say hi? Say hi. I am 19 weeks old. And a big puker. Pig puker.